probably once again, I'm going to go the longest, but I'm just going to take one. And the one that is most interesting to me right now is it's an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal that came out January 19th, so last week. And it's entitled Economists' Statement on Carbon Dividends. At least that's what the title is in the online version. And the subtitle is Bipartisan Agreement on How to Combat Climate Change. And the most notable thing about this is that it is it is signed by a very, very prestigious group of people. It's a combination of Federal Reserve chairmen and then winners of the Nobel Prize, and then I believe 27 of those members or chairs of the Council of Economic Advisors, former chairs. So lots and lots of prestigious names. And what it entails is these economists are all coming together and they are saying that we should have a carbon dividend, which that basically means tax on CO2, but they don't like the term tax. So they're saying dividend, but it's not a dividend in the same normal way that you just get dividends on some investment that you make. This is where, in a sense, maybe it's called dividend because the idea is that everyone will pay a tax for all the CO2 they emit, and then it will be returned in the form of a dividend to certain people. So I want to, first of all, I'd recommend that you read it, but I just want to give a quick overview and then give some thoughts, particularly one thought that really bothers me with how people, particularly economists, talk about energy issues in a way that I think is just very deeply wrong. So it begins with global climate change is a serious problem calling for immediate international action. Okay, so I read that, and I mentioned last week, or I discussed last week, I have a certain framework for processing certain things, and there are a few elements. One of the elements is that I want people to look at the full context, so to look for both positives and negatives for any given policy or technology or product, and I want them to be clear about the goal, and I believe the goal should be some form of human flourishing, and I want them to give careful explanations, at least where they can, and I want them to acknowledge their assumptions. So those parts of the framework may come up this week. The thing that I notice here immediately when they say global climate change is a serious problem calling for immediate international action is just, okay, but what's the full context here? Because the full context in terms of serious problems calling for intermediate international action, well, in a sense, the most serious problem that exists is poverty, because that's really the lack of resources, which leads to the lack of life. So in my mind, particularly because I know that energy is a fundamental alleviator of poverty, my question is, what about global poverty? And unfortunately, that is not answered, and there's no concern expressed for it in this entire article, which is going to become important. I think when you're talking about energy and any potential negative of energy, and you don't talk about all of the fundamentally positive impacts of energy, there is an issue. Okay, so it says, it's got this statement of problem, and it says, guided by sound economic principles, we are united in the following policy recommendations. Okay, if they don't say so themselves, they're guided by sound economic principles. And then it says, a carbon tax offers the most cost-effective lever to reduce carbon emissions at the scale and speed that is necessary. By correcting a well-known market failure, a carbon tax will send a powerful price signal that harnesses the invisible hand of the marketplace to steer economic actors towards a low-carbon future. I'll actually just read the whole thing because it's very short. 2. So one is it's the most cost-effective lever, correcting a well-known market failure. That's going to be important. 2, a carbon tax should increase every year until emissions reductions goals are met and be revenue neutral to avoid debates over the size of government. I'll talk about revenue neutral as well. A consistently rising carbon price will encourage technological innovation and large-scale infrastructure development. It will also accelerate the diffusion of carbon-efficient goods and services. 3, a sufficiently robust and gradually rising carbon tax will replace the need for various carbon regulations that are less efficient. Substituting a price signal for cumbersome regulations will promote economic growth and provide the regulatory certainty companies need for long-term investment in clean energy alternatives. 4, To prevent carbon leakage and to protect U.S. competitiveness, a border carbon adjustment system should be established. This system would enhance the competitiveness of American firms that are more energy efficient than their global competitors. It would also create an incentive for other nations to adopt similar carbon pricing. 5, and this is the last one, to maximize the fairness and political viability of a rising carbon tax. Oh, now it's a tax. All the revenue should be, they didn't say that. I said that, sorry. Viability of a rising carbon tax. All the revenue should be returned directly to U.S. citizens through equal lump sum rebates. The majority of American families, including the most vulnerable, will benefit financially by receiving more in carbon dividends than they pay in increased energy prices. And that is, I think this last sentence is really core to the plausibility of this piece and this argument, and really what I want to challenge. So it says the majority of American families, including the most vulnerable, will benefit financially by receiving more in carbon dividends than they pay in increased energy prices. That might be the most important sentence. The other one might be, by earlier, I said, I quoted, by correcting a well-known market failure, a carbon tax will send a powerful price signal that harnesses the invisible hand of the marketplace to steer economic actors towards a low carbon future. So there's this market failure, and then we're correcting it in a way that will be beneficial to most people. And as part of that, it will be quote unquote revenue neutral. So it sounds like, okay, there's a problem that we're correcting, and we're correcting it in a way that does not hurt anyone, and or does not hurt anyone we really care about, in this case, rich people, and will actually help poorer people. So by taxing the use of coal, oil, and natural gas, everyone, or at least particularly poor and middle class people, will come out on top. So that may sound like it has some plausibility, particularly because there's this idea of, okay, don't worry about the tax, because whatever money you're taxed, that's going to be given back to you, or you might even get some of other people's taxes if you're poor or middle class. So you should be like, don't worry about the tax. I mean, there's no problem, right? If you're going to get the money back, there's no problem. And then it's called revenue neutral. The reason it's called revenue neutral is that's the perspective of the government, which means that the government, you might be afraid, oh, well, the government is just taxing us, and then the government's just going to take more money. And I don't want the government to get a whole bunch of new money. So if it's revenue neutral, that means whatever the government takes, the government will give back to somebody. The government, so to speak, will not make any more money. So this is supposed to be reassuring. And I don't consider it reassuring at all. And I want to give you an analogy to illustrate why. So imagine that, there's this idea of a social cost or a market failure. And the idea there is that there are certain hidden costs of using fossil fuels, namely negative consequences of CO2 emissions that are not quote unquote priced into fossil fuels, which is a whole involved idea itself. Basically, there's this kind of hidden cost. And you can say this with they sometimes call it negative externality. You can say this with just about anything. You can, even very positive things, you can say, oh, it has significant negative externalities. So you can find negative externalities or hidden costs with just about anything. So here's one. Let's talk about math education. Now, math education, people think of as a good thing generally, but math education certainly has plenty of negative externalities, because what it does is it makes populations more adept at engineering, which requires knowledge of math. And then that leads to all sorts of negative uses of technology. For example, acts of terrorism often involve technology that are made possible because some people learned math. And yet when we're paying for math education, we're not paying for that hidden cost. There's no fee that we pay that says, oh, this is the terrorism cost or this is the abuse cost. So let's say somebody says, oh, I'm really concerned because there are all these negative externalities of math education. So let's do this. Let's pass a math tax, or maybe a math dividend, but let's say a math tax. And what we're going to do is we're going to double the price of a math education until math education, until the negative consequences of math education go down to some sort of prescribed level. So, but don't worry, we're going to tax math education. We're going to double the price of it. But we're going to give all of the receipts back to everyone. We're going to give them back to everyone equally. So poor people will get even more money. So let's say that we get, let's say that there was average $1,000. Let's say so we pass this tax, we double the cost of math education. And then each American, we divide up all the proceeds and each American gets a $200 annual check. So it's revenue neutral and it's addressing a market failure. Well, would anybody think that that money is well spent, that there's no problem and that it's even a benefit to some people? No, because you'd say, wait a second, but people aren't learning math. We've enacted a policy to systematically discourage the learning of math in our society. And that learning of math is so fundamental to the well-being of people in society, particularly over time. So what we've done is we have used, revenue neutral or not isn't really the issue, is we've used taxation to systematically discourage a fundamentally productive behavior. And that's the key idea here, is that we always need to be really concerned with any kind of taxation for manipulation, which is what this kind of thing is, that we are systematically discouraging a fundamentally productive behavior. And I certainly argue that the use of energy, and that particularly fossil fuel energy, which is very cost effective in most situations relative to the alternatives, that something you are doing to discourage the production of energy is causing huge problems. It's not only that it's causing consumers to have higher energy bills. That's in a sense the least of the problems. The problem is that it's causing the energy bill of every single industrial person trying to do anything to be higher. So it makes mining more expensive, manufacturing more expensive, transportation more expensive. So every little input in the whole economy that makes up our standard of living is powered by energy. So if you make the whole thing more expensive, then what you're doing is you're discouraging productive activity throughout the economy. And I'll give a historical example, which didn't happen, but easily could have happened. So let's go 10, 15 years ago, 10 or 12 years ago, maybe, when the shale revolution in the US was beginning. And let's focus in particular on shale gas. The phenomenon of shale gas, of cheap, plentiful, reliable natural gas, has led to a ton of beneficial economic activity, different factories that are powered that wouldn't otherwise exist, and then all kinds of different jobs created. There's just all these amazing benefits from having cheap, plentiful, reliable natural gas. But imagine if we had a fracking tax, let's say 12 years ago, that doubled the price of that fracked gas. Well, all of that activity wouldn't have happened, or much less of it would have happened. So let's say that discouraged 80% of that activity. Well, then the government would collect a certain amount of revenue and give it out to other people. But the real story would be the fundamentally productive behavior that was discouraged. And this is what we really need to be thinking about with the issue of energy, is, are we discouraging a fundamental productive behavior in our economy? And we absolutely are, if we study it. Now, one of the big problems of this article is that it does not look at the full context in many ways, including it does not look at the actual state of the alternatives. Because if you're saying, okay, something has this hidden cost, well, what about all the hidden benefits of energy, and how do those compare to other forms of energy? Well, if other forms of energy aren't nearly as good at producing cheap, plentiful, reliable energy, then you're not going to get all of those hidden benefits. And what's happening with the actual state of energy? Well, the actual state of energy is there are, let's say, 4 alternatives that have any kind of plausibility, maybe 5. So solar, wind, biofuels, hydro, nuclear. Now, solar and wind are the ones that these days are most permitted. Biofuels are sort of out of fashion with everyone for various reasons because they have huge inefficiency issues. And then hydro is very potent, but has a lot of green opposition, and it's very limited in terms of where you can do it. And then nuclear is basically criminalized by the green movement. Now, with solar and wind, you have intermittency, which is just a fundamental problem because you can't rely on the fuel source, which means you need 100% life support by a reliable fuel source, which usually means fossil fuels or nuclear to some degree, but that is basically prohibited. So what we're talking about here is people are saying, oh yeah, let's just pass a tax and then people will use alternatives. But they've criminalized the best alternative. And these guys have nothing to say about that. These economists have nothing to say about that. And they have nothing to say about the fundamental intermittency problem that the de facto alternatives actually face. So they've seen it fit to do no research into the or at least to have no acknowledgement of the actual state of the alternatives and also the actual state of policy. So there are many other issues that I have with this, but the fundamental one that really struck me was just this complete evasion of the cost of dramatically restricting or discouraging a fundamental part of an economy and just acting like, oh, well, if we tax it and we give the tax money to people, no harm done. No, it's the discouragement of productive activity. Even if you doubled the tax receipts somehow, that would be a huge, huge problem. And I'm really glad we didn't do this in the past. And it's really scary that we're talking about doing this in the future. Now, I should say one positive of this piece sort of is that one thing they're trying to do positively, and I think one reason why they got a lot of people to sign up, is that there's a movement to oppose fossil fuels in even more irrational ways, namely the Green New Deal, which is all about mandating very specific solar and wind non-solutions. And that would be even more destructive than this kind of thing. So I think a lot of people are saying, well, if we're going to do something, then let's at least do a tax because a tax is more efficient. But if you really want to do something about the CO2 issue, if that's an issue for you, you have to focus on to promote human flourishing and reduce CO2, you need a cost-effective, scalable source of non-carbon energy. And the key obstacle to that is not a lack of a tax on CO2. The key obstacle to that is green criminalization of productive activity, particularly in nuclear. So you have to focus on that. And these economists are not. And among other reasons, that's why I think that this op-ed is very problematic and will have many destructive consequences. There's other things that I have issues with in terms of, I think it's very dogmatic. They don't talk at all about why they're convinced about climate. They don't talk at all about the state of the field of climate science, whether it has any track record of predicting things correctly, which I think it has a very weak track record. There's no acknowledgement of the value of energy to adapting to climate. So there's a whole bunch of other things, but for me, the elephant in the room is that they don't even entertain the idea of the cost of discouraging this, of discouraging like a fundamental productive input in our economy. Did you guys have any thoughts on this?
I mean, mine is essentially your same point, but from a different perspective, which is like the core value of economics. So one of the best books to start on economics is this book, Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. And here, the one lesson is that you can't just look at the obvious costs or benefits of something. You have to look, in our terminology, at the full context, but it's that you need to see the whole chain of cause and effect. And that's like what economists, like that is their job. Their job is to point out the whole cause and effect of different policies so that we can make good economic choices. And here the whole focus is on pretending that there is this free lunch where we can restrict our best form of energy and don't worry, it's not going to cost you a thing. In fact, you might come out ahead. And part of the cost that they're ignoring is the fact that not everybody comes out ahead, even on its own terms. And then, as you pointed out, the fundamental cost is you're cutting off a whole range of productive actions that are vital to human flourishing.
Stefan, I know you had something about the border adjustment part of it, and just to give a little context, because that was probably one of the least clear parts of it, unless you're really following this. The thing this is trying to address is, won't a tax on carbon dioxide hurt the U.S. by being a leader in this, by passing a tax on CO2 when others don't? Won't we really be suckers? Because then we'll just make our goods more expensive and less competitive. And the idea here is, oh, if we just pass a border adjustment system, basically we will impose a tax on imported goods. So if other people are using a lot of CO2 emitting energy in their goods, then we'll tax those more. And so then we'll encourage the whole world to emit less CO2. So Stefan, I know you had some concern about that.
Yeah, so it's by its nature, this tax is a domestic policy, and we have no idea whether China or India, the future biggest emitters, will follow with anything like that. And so this idea that we can just put a tariff at the border on products and then the problem will go away, that doesn't really do it, I think. And so one problem here is the big administrative overhead just to determine how much of, let's say, a finished product like a smartphone imported from Asia into the United States, how much of that does it have in sort of embedded CO2 emissions, right? So you would have a giant accounting sheet, for every piece of raw material and every process and every factory involved in this production of the smartphone. You would have to account how efficient did they do this, and how much CO2 did every step take, and so on. And that needs to be done for every single product in order to make it fair. And even then, if that's successful, and this will probably be the biggest agency in US history, which is saying something. So even then, it's not clear that this isn't being circumvented by competitors by just taking entire chains of production out of the US economy, and just, instead of doing something like a memory chip from Malaysia imported into America to be built into some computer or some device, why don't we build just the entire device or computer in Malaysia, right? So you could cripple the American economy without actually solving the CO2 emission problem, and just putting a tariff on the border is difficult in itself, and it might not even remotely solve the problem.
All right. Yeah. In general, I think that when people think about the issue of fossil fuels, they have this idea that anything you do to discourage fossil fuels is a pretty good idea. So we don't need to be too careful if we prescribe some way of dealing with it. Even economists whose supposed specialty is that, they're just advocating these things and they're all signing on to it. And they're really not thinking through all of the implications.